Hey guys, welcome back to the House of Gouldians. So in this week's episode, we've got quite a bit to cover. So in terms of the sort of general bird room and what's going on, it's very much the beginnings of the breeding season. The birds are starting to come into condition nicely, so there's lots of singing and dancing that's happening in the mornings, especially when the lights go on and I start feeding the birds. And that's great, but you'll notice that the boxes aren't on most of the cages yet, and that's done very deliberately as our two major shows are happening over the next 2 weeks in terms of the Gouldian calendar. And that is the club that I belong to, our Championship Cup is coming up. And then the week after that is the Supreme Show by one of our sister clubs in the country. So it's really an exciting time if you're into the showing side of Gouldians and the hobby, but it does mean that you wait until after those shows before you really start pairing up your birds in earnest, because obviously the moment the birds start building nests and that kind of thing, you're going to get damaged tails and missing feathers and that type of thing from just the normal breeding process. So there's nothing wrong with that, but that's why, as anyone that sort of shows Gouldians, unless they've separated a show team, you'll find that they don't really start properly with their breeding until after that. The majestic bloodline side of the show today is going to be very important, particularly if you're new to Gouldians, because we need to realize that it's not all sunshine and roses. And you would have seen by the thumbnail that we've had a bit of tragedy, and it's nothing major, it's just typical of first year birds. So I'm going to discuss breeding, particularly the pitfalls with breeding first year birds in this particular episode. And then on the education side of things, we're going to be looking at how I go about making my grit. So that's this week's episode. Enjoy. I wanted to discuss some of the pitfalls of breeding first year birds. And a lot of guys doing a YouTube channel or whatever, trying to get guys into the hobby, and that might neglect the negative side of things. What can go wrong, in other words. And it's unfair because a newcomer to the hobby is expecting sunshine and roses, and the reality is whenever you're breeding any animal or keeping any animal, there will always be tragedies and sort of missteps, if you like. So I want you to see the good and the bad, and as a result I'm not going to be hiding anything from you. You coming along the journey with me for this breeding season, and you're going to see the successes and you're going to see the failures as well. So basically, when I started the channel, I knew that I needed to get in some pairs on the normal side, the wild type, so the purple-breasted greenbacks, and I needed to buy a few pairs. And when I buy birds, I typically like to buy that year's youngsters, because I know that they're young birds, they haven't been bred, so the breeder's not selling them because there may be problems with them. So the hen might suffer from, she might battle to pass eggs, or they don't calcify properly, or something like that, although there's lots of reasons that can cause that. Some of that's fixable. But the point being, like a cockbird might be a chick tosser or something like that. So the moment the bird's more than a season old, you've got to start asking, well, why would the breeder be selling a bird that's in its prime? Okay, so it's quite important to keep that in mind when you are buying birds. But the flip side of that is that if you're wanting to start breeding, that first year you ideally don't want to breed the birds because they're not fully mature. And you might have heard me in a previous episode refer to them as being teenagers. So they can physically breed, but it doesn't mean you should breed them. Now, coming back to what I was saying about starting the channel, because I needed to buy in a bunch of birds, and they were majority first years, I was caught with a bit of a conundrum in that, do I try and breed them the first year, which I don't normally do, or do I hold them back? But then it would have probably delayed the start of the channel until next season. So I decided to give it a go, but I did it knowing full well that it was going to be a potentially risky start to the season. What do I mean by that? So a first year hen, because they're not 100% mature, one of the risks is that they could suffer from egg binding. Now, I give a lot of calcium in my grit, as you're going to see in the education segment of today's show. There's various forms of calcium sources that go into it. So that side of it, provided the hen is just over a year mark before I try and breed her, I was pretty convinced I can mitigate that. So she's still over a year, but she's not a second year bird, which is ideal with your hens and your cocks for breeding purposes. So that was risk number one. Hens aren't as prone to chucking chicks out of the nest as your cock birds are. So that's less of a risk with a first year hen, but it can still happen. But it brings me to the cock birds, and a first year cock bird is really not an ideal bird to breed with. And why we say that is that there's a bunch of behavior problems that happen typically with first year cocks, because they're not fully mature. They're literally like teenager boys, where they want to have all the fun but they don't want the responsibility. So the type of things that happen is that they will build a nest and they will coax the hen into breeding, and they'll lay a clutch of eggs, but then they'll either start building a nest on top of it because they want to mate again and they're not really bothered about the incubation and raising of the chicks. Or alternatively, when the chicks hatch, they tend to be they're a lot more likely, shall we say, to throw the chicks out the nest. Now, it doesn't mean that every first year bird's going to do that. So bear that in mind. This isn't a one equals the other type scenario. It's a higher probability. So those are sort of your most common pitfalls. The other one is that you'll get parent birds that perhaps don't feed the chicks. So they'll hatch them, they'll sit on them, they'll keep them warm, so they'll brood them, in other words, but they don't actually feed them, and then you'll end up with dead babies in the nest. So they haven't been thrown out, but they die in the actual nest from a lack of feeding from the parents. And it's typically these issues that causes a lot of breeders, particularly overseas, to use society finches because they think that the Gouldians are useless parents. In my experience, they're not bad parents at all, but you tend to have problems if you're using first year birds. Okay, so the thumbnail of today was the pair behind me, which is Egbert and Victoria. And the issue with them is, so first of all, not all the eggs were filled. So 2 out of the 4 weren't fertile. And that tells me that the cockbird was still trying to figure out what to do. So we can understand the fertility being a little bit lower on our first round with them because it's the first time they're ever breeding. So that part we understand. The next issue that we had is that there was a dead in shell egg. Now, 2 possible causes of that. The one is exactly what I'm doing now. I'm standing close to the cage and I'm filming. And my birds are getting used to me filming in the bird room, but it doesn't mean that if the hen was out of the box when I came into the room and started filming, that she would then go back. And as a result, the eggs may have got a little bit cold and we had some dead in shells. There are other potential causes for dead in shell, but in this case, I think that's the most likely thing that happened, is that the hen was off the nest for too long and we had a dead in shell. And then the other egg, so egg number 4 that hatched, exactly what I was talking about now. Because of it being a first year cock, he saw this little thing in the nest. He wasn't mentally mature enough and he pitched it out the nest and threw it out. So I've taken the box away, as you've seen, and I'm now going to give them a little bit longer to mature So I'll hold them back for a month, which takes it after the show season. So the hen bird I might use on the show bench over the next couple of weeks. The cockbird, he had lost his tail during the nest building process, so he won't be used. But the hen bird I may use. But after a month, the hen, so in other words, it would be when they're due to be doing round 2 naturally, because of the time that it takes them to get the chicks out of the nest box before the hen will start relaying eggs again. I'll then put the box back and then they can start again. And hopefully the second round will have more success. I don't go third round as a general rule, and it was actually one of the discussions we were having on the chat side of the show this week in terms of the YouTube channel under the discussions. And it was brought up that I speak to you guys specifically about how many rounds to do. And the reason I say I don't go past 2 rounds is that I've found that if you push them to do a third round, the hen has now laid probably 12 eggs or more, and you're starting to really drain a lot of calcium out of your hen's body because it comes out of her reserves. And the result being is that you tend to lose your hens during the molting season. So that is why I don't recommend guys go past 2 rounds, and certainly not past 3 rounds. With them, if their second round is not successful, I may push it and then take their eggs and foster them under another pair of Gouldians that I know raise chicks very successfully, so that I can guarantee that I've got some of their blood. But yeah, more than likely I won't do it, purely because of the risks involved to the hen. What I'd rather do is take some of their eggs from round 2, swap it with one of those good parents. So they still have the opportunity to prove themselves as parents, but I guarantee their blood, if you like, through another pair. So that would be the better way to do it, and that's if I've got another pair that's breeding at the same time as them, that's what I'll do. I'll swap eggs on them. Alright, so that's that particular cage. The other box that you'll notice is missing, and it's also was first year bird. So it was Alfonso and Yuriko, which you haven't sort of met in detail yet in terms of having an up-close look at them. But they're an orange-headed, purple-breasted pair, also from the house of Batista, and also first-year birds. And we had the other issue with the hen. So what tends to happen, or the other potential issue is that the hen isn't ready to start breeding yet from a maturity point of view. Physically she can, but she's kind of pushed into it because now you had paired them up. So what happened? Well, she became an egg dropper. And that's a particularly dangerous situation because they're not starting to incubate the eggs, so they don't take a break. They just keep laying eggs. And then what happens, it depletes the calcium, and you'll find you'll lose the hens for sure during the molting period. So when I saw that was the case, so I then immediately took the box away. But how did I pick it up? So they'd laid 3 eggs, which you would have picked up in the previous episode, and then nothing happened for about a week. But they didn't start sitting either. And then they laid more eggs, but once again, they stopped laying eggs but didn't continue to or start sitting. So immediately it tells me, hang on, the hen is not actually wanting to breed as yet. She has come into condition. She is past a year of age, but she's not mentally mature and ready to actually commit to raising chicks. So once again, like I said, I took the box away. I'll give them a month, let her recoup some of the calcium that she would have lost from laying the first clutch, and then I will give them another opportunity. If the same thing happens, I'll then stop them, take the box away, and I won't try and breed them until next season. And it comes back to what I was saying right in the beginning, in that second year birds is far better. So that's kind of the Majestic today. I know I've been talking a lot and you guys haven't seen as many birds, but the topic is extremely important, and particularly for new guys to the hobby. You're going to have failures, but a lot of those failures are caused by guys being excited. They buy the birds, they're young birds, and they put them straight into a nest box and try and breed them, and then they wonder why they have all these problems. And then the Gouldian gets a bad reputation because now they're difficult to breed and they don't look after their babies, so now you have to have society finches and a whole pile of stuff that, quite honestly, is the keeper's fault. Alright, so we're going to need a couple of things. So we're going to need cuttlefish, we're going to need some eggshells, iodine blocks, and then oyster grit as well. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is just chop up the cuttlefish. Some guys do add carbon, and that's fine. I just don't like to give it to the birds permanently, as there's some indication that it also affects the good bacteria in the gut if you're giving it to them permanently. So I prefer to give that sort of once a week or once every second week. I'll give the birds carbon. You can see basically all I'm trying to do here is break it up into a lot smaller pieces so that it will go a lot further in terms of the mix. So yeah, generally I do 2 cuttlefish into a batch. Okay. Once that's been done, the next thing I'll add is my eggshells. The oyster grit. And then the last thing that we're going to cut up is an iodine block for the birds as well. You can see this is quite a messy job, which is why I'm not doing it in the kitchen, as I don't want to be in trouble with the missus. Once again, I don't want to make it too fine, I just want to Okay, so that was my thoughts around breeding first year birds and also how I do my grit mix. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode, and I look forward to seeing you next week.